The smugglers would be trying to smuggle out oil, and they would try all sorts of things to prevent boarding teams apprehending them.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
They were building positions in there.
If anything happened to us, by the time anyone got to us,
I think it was chaos.
The weather was so bad there would be nobody left.
Boots full of blood.
And the next thing I hear was alarms, screaming.
Survival were very, very slim.
The soldiers didn't want to go into the ambushes, so they'd send the kids in first. And so he was sent in first into an ambush and he got shot in the stomach.
It was very hard for me, very hard for my family.
And the plane burst into
proud of the crew, proud of what I've achieved and what I'm doing.
Volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Peter Jones retired from the Royal Australian Navy in 2014 at the rank of Vice Admiral. He's now the president of the Australian Naval Institute. This is his conversation with Life on the Line about his time in the Arabian Gulf.
I'm Angus Hordern, and in Canberra today with Peter Jones. Peter, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure, Angus.
Peter, what inspired you to join the Navy?
Well, I grew up in Sydney and my dad had a fishing boat, then a sailing boat, and we sailed on Sydney Harbour. I originally wanted to be a naval architect, but come 15, I wanted to leave home. And the Navy at that time had the opportunity to go to the Naval College at 16.
Can you tell us about your early service with the Navy? Where was your basic training?
So the basic training was at the Naval College at Jervis Bay. So we did initially 2 years where they had two small sets of classrooms to complete the last 2 years of high school. We completed high school, and then it depended on whether you were going to do a degree and what sort. And in my case, I did an arts degree, so we had the opportunity to go back up to Sydney and complete our degree at the University of New South Wales. And during the uni breaks, we'd either go back to Navy training or go to sea and on the training cruise. But so we had the best of both worlds, if you like, uni students with some money in the pocket.
Are there any particular striking memories from those encounters with foreign vessels or anything more light-hearted that you can recount from those times?
Well, certainly our initial time at Jervis Bay when ships would come in, because the exercise area is just off Jervis Bay, of course. Quite often the cadet midshipman would be sent to sea for the day. And I remember our first time at sea on HMAS Brisbane, and it was quite a rough day, and we spent an awful lot of time on the upper deck throwing up and wondering whether we'd made the right career choice.
Peter, can you tell us about your first command at sea, please?
My first command was actually the frigate HMAS Melbourne. So I joined her in 1998, so as commander. So some people have the opportunity to command a patrol boat early on, but for me, it was the frigate Melbourne.
And is that the only Melbourne that you've actually served on?
No, I was, as a junior officer, I was a trainee officer watch on the carrier Melbourne, and in 1980, and that was a very interesting time. They still had Skyhawk A4 fighters on board. We went to the Indian Ocean. In fact, on one watch I had, we lost a Skyhawk taking off from the catapult, and so that was interesting seeing the pilot go past your bridge window in a parachute. But very interesting period being on Melbourne and just seeing what a complex ship it was. And it was thoroughly enjoyable as an officer watch just to see all those moving parts come together.
You become the skipper of Melbourne, and you, as you said, you previously hadn't had command, but you're now commanding actually a major frigate with hundreds of people under your command. How did you suddenly step up to that role?
Yes, I remember I was very fortunate in terms of the program. In fact, we just had a couple of weeks after I took command, we were going to the Rim of the Pacific exercise, or RIMPAC in Hawaii. So it was a very busy time preparing to go to that exercise and go. But I remember the first time we were casting off, and I said to the XO, is there any particular place I should stand? And he said, you just stand where you like and they'll come to you. And that was, of course, very true. And also you find that you're a little bit unsure of yourself initially, but you don't try to show that. But after a while, you realise that you've had lots of experience. You've been second in charge of a ship. You've had many years at sea, and after the first week at sea, you feel a lot more comfortable.
I could imagine the big difference would be is as an XO, you've always got a CO to talk to, but as a CO, you can't talk up to anyone else.
Yes, that's very true. What you do have, though, is there is a bit of a brotherhood of captains. And so in my case, as I said, we were in a task group going across to Hawaii. The task group commander was a Captain Lou Rago. He was become a great friend, and he would, in port, he would always go for his constitutional walk around the dockyard. And so I would always join him. And it was good just to have a chat and just about, the things you go through and so on. And I found that over the time that it's great that you have other COs you can just talk to. As you say, there's no one else you can really talk to. But having said that, I think one of the things I did do, and a number of other captains do this, if you know some people from previous ships that are now serving on your ship, and you may have known them for 20, 30 years, sometimes you just individually say to that person, if you see that I'm doing something that's really stupid, just come and tell me. On board, I had a couple of people who had that, that personal past to come and just tell me how things are going. And that's invaluable because you do need that sort of, that check.
Now, for your service on Melbourne, you were recognised on account of the proficiency of your operations in the ship.
Yes, so I was fortunate enough to become a member of the Order of Australia. So in the first year we did RIMPAC. In the second year we actually went to the Arabian Gulf and we did sanctions enforcement as part of the UN Security Council resolutions against Iraq. And really that award was really a reflection for the performance of the ship in those boardings. And they were quite trying in terms of we were there in the hot part of the year, and so the weather was regularly in the high 40s, and so it's really quite difficult for the boarding teams to be able to conduct their business in such a difficult environment.
So let's go forward to the Arabian Gulf, and in 2002 you've joined the United States Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Paul Hamilton. You're not taking command of the ship, but you're on board the ship and you're acting as the Maritime Interception Operations Commander. So before we get to that action, can you explain that command structure that you're now in?
Yes, certainly. So what had happened after September 11 is that there'd been quite a big force build-up in the Arabian Gulf, and Australia had provided an increased number of ships, normally 2 ships, and they'd also offered a task group commander to command the multinational task group operating in the northern part of the Gulf. The standard countries that would participate in the Maritime Interception Force were Britain, Australia and the US, but you'd also have other countries. So, for example, there was a Polish ship in that area. That was, if you like, continuing that UN sanction enforcement that I was involved in 1999, and in fact those sanction enforcements had been going on since the end of the Gulf War, so a very long-term commitment for the Navy. So the arrangement was that Australia would provide a task group commander and a staff, and normally that staff would rotate on an alternating basis with a US Navy captain and his staff, and they were normally resident at the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, and so there'd be that 50-50 arrangement. In my case, we knew that because of the international tensions and tensions with Iraq, that if there was going to be a conflict, it was going to be in the cool part of the year. So that was going to coincide with the end of 2002, beginning of 2003. So as a result of that, I went into the Gulf with a larger staff of about 17, and also with the prospect of spending a lot more time at sea. And indeed, instead of having a 50-50 arrangement, we spent all but 2 weeks at sea.
So within hours, literally, of onboarding Hamilton, you actually had your first incident.
Yes, that's right. So one of the things with sanction enforcement was that it was a very dynamic environment. The smugglers would be trying to smuggle out oil, or they'd be trying to smuggle out dates, and they'd do that in either dhows, which are small wooden traditional cargo vessels, or old merchant ships. And they would try all sorts of things to prevent boarding teams apprehending them or turning them back to go back up to the Khor Abdullah waterway, which was the main waterway up to Qasr and into Iraq. That was quite dynamic, and they would do things like they'd put barbed wire on their guardrails, they'd electrify guardrails, they'd weld doors shut. So that was one aspect. But the thing that had just recently changed was that the Iraqi Navy had their patrol boats, their small PB-90 patrol boats, had started to do sorties out at the entrance to the Khor Abdullah waterway. And there was some uncertainty about what were they trying to do? Were they trying to maybe promote some sort of incident or something like that? So there's a lot of unsurety. The routine was that you would have a missile-armed helicopter in the air, and you would be tracking what that patrol boat did. And in the operations room, you could see a video stream from the helicopter, what was happening on the deck of the patrol boat. So you had to make sure that it didn't stray too far south and didn't impede operations and so on. So that was our first introduction into the theatre, and that was the first morning we were there. After that first morning, where eventually the patrol boat continued back up to its home port, we then realised we're in quite an intense environment. And we also I sat down with the team and we sort of worked out, well, what can we do to make this a sustainable operation? And one of the things we concluded was that there's a fair bet that patrol boat would be intimidated by our frigates. And in fact, that's what we did. So every time a patrol boat turned up, we would send our frigates that had shallow and aft draft further north, close to the entrance to the Khor Abdullah waterway, and sure enough, that did intimidate the patrol boat. And we had that confirmed by talking to some of the merchant ship masters. They told us that the patrol boat captain had complained about our intimidating approach. So that was good.
Peter, can you elaborate? How big are these Iraqi patrol boats? What is their offensive capability versus the size of your frigate and what you can do back to it?
Yes, so it was quite a stark difference. The patrol boat was really smaller than the patrol boats we have going around our coastline. So they would have been about 35 metres or thereabouts, less than 400 tonnes, and whereas our frigates were at least 4,000 tonnes and missile armed. But having said that, the patrol boat had a gun, and it had they fitted some anti-tank rockets on board. So if you were close in, they could do quite a lot of damage, particularly noting that this was peacetime, so they could potentially get quite close. So that's why you didn't want to take any chances. And certainly my view was that you couldn't allow them to get the first shot in. We're very keen to try and de-escalate as much as we can, because we're very conscious that no one wanted a conflict at this point in time, and not one that just happened out of the blue. So you had to try and ensure that the situation was de-escalated. And so as a task group commander, I was carefully watching what was happening on the video screen. And at times you found people got very excited. Sometimes you've said the helicopter would report that the Iraqi crew are moving towards their gun on the front of the ship, but you could see on the big screen, with using their same video that they were seeing, you could see that they were just going down and they were just having a look at their anchor and things like that. So you had to be very watchful about what reports were made so that there wasn't any inadvertent escalation.
And what sort of range, Peter, would be unacceptable to you to allow them to come towards the frigate?
So I was keen for them not to come within a mile, and we achieved that. Because basically they thought that our ships were quite aggressive in their manoeuvring.
You had other Aussies in the area too. Captain Steve McDowell on your old ship, the Melbourne, and on the Arunta was Commander Ray Griggs, who is now, of course, a Vice Admiral and Vice Chief of the Defence Force. Can you tell us some of the action and encounters that you had while you were at sea in the Gulf?
Yes, so we're very fortunate in terms of the task group staff. We flew into the Gulf, in fact, on a Latvian Ilyushin 76 cargo aircraft. So we flew in and then flew into the American ship to take over command. The ships that we were associated with in our rotation was, of course, Darwin and Anzac, and they were still steaming from Australia. So we had the benefit of coming in and having very seasoned ships in the form of the Melbourne and the Arunta, still on station, very well versed in the boardings. And one of the features of the boardings at that time was most of the activity with the smugglers was at night, and sometimes they'd do what we used to call a mass breakout of dhows. So you may have 20 or 30 dhows coming out all in one go with the obvious intention of trying to swamp the Maritime Interception Force and wouldn't be able to intercept them all. But, ships like those two, they were really quite capable of sending out multiple boarding parties, and we could generate maybe half a dozen boarding parties in the water within the task group, and to be able to have sufficient ability to be able to turn around a mass breakout. So by that stage, both Melbourne and Arunta had done each over 300 boardings. So they were, outstanding ships, but, that many, many months of service, but they were coming to the end of their time and they were clearly getting quite tired because it's quite arduous work.
And Peter, when we do a boarding, we're talking about a Zodiac with, half a dozen sailors, or? Yes,
that's right. So it's essentially like a fast rubber boat. We had 7 different sorts of boarding teams as well. So each Navy would have a different sort of boat, a different boarding team. We also had 2 special forces that would come out from Kuwait in a larger boat. There was the US Navy SEALs and the Polish GROM, which was the Polish Special Forces. So they would come out at night. We'd typically have a liaison officer normally from the GROM, on board our ship, and they would also do boarding. So you had to be cognizant of what were the different abilities, and essentially they would board the ship, inspect what was on the ship. If it had contraband cargo, they would then be turned around. So they'd go back up the river, and sometimes they'd come back. And our routine was that if we had the opportunity, if the dhow was coming back for the second time that night, we'd put the GROM on board. One of the things with the GROM's procedure was they'd keep people's hands up all the time, and these guys, their arms got quite sore, so they never wanted to come back a third time. So that was the dhows. With the steel hulls, the big merchant ships, they were less numerous, but they were a tougher challenge, as I explained, because they would have defensive things to stop boarding teams getting up on board the ship, and also getting access into the engine room or the bridge to take control of the ship.
Okay, so a lot of these breakouts are at night for obvious reasons. Does your night vision enable you to see which are the bigger assets to go for, and are you deploying the SEAL teams to them and regular Navy for the lesser ships?
Yes, so we were very fortunate because there was that video link that was in the American helicopters. We would get the helicopter to fly at a reasonable altitude, and we could look right up the Corbella waterway for maybe 10, 15 miles, and you could see the small towns, you can see the cars going around and everything, but importantly for us, you'd see what was coming down the river, and you had like an aerial view of the whole thing, and then you could sort of plan your dispositions about which ships were to take what part of the mass breakout.
Were there any particular incidents that you can share that you're aware of it getting a bit heavy-handed, and maybe in those SEAL team operations, action actually happening?
We were very conscious of pressing upon people. The whole approach was to de-escalate and reduce any tension in boardings, because the more you did that, the more the boardings were compliant, there was less chance for accidents and so on. So during my time, we had 27 different ships come through the task group for a period of service, and then they would rotate out. So we would make a big point of indoctrinating new ships coming in who, were obviously very keen and eager this is the way it works. There's typically no violence on the part of the smugglers. They're there for business, but, obviously they don't want to make it easy for you necessarily to get on board, but it was really important to be very professional and so on. So we had to monitor that. We had a couple of incidents where a couple of boarding parties, not from Australia, but they took some articles from a ship. We learnt that subsequently, and we learnt which ship it was, and then we got the CO to do an investigation, and action was resulted from that. So that was all part of that whole de-escalation process. We did have one incident 2 days before the war started where a Kuwaiti patrol boat, the Kuwaitis were operating to the west of us, close to the shore of Kuwait, they fired a warning shot on a dhow, and a bullet actually killed one of the crew, one of the smugglers. And I sent a boarding team from the Anzac on board that dhow with a medical officer, and a very difficult situation, because it was one of those things where if it went wrong, it could have been used as a propaganda type thing by Saddam Hussein. But the young boarding officer did a terrific job in terms of just really de-escalating that situation as much as he could. In fact, the sailor who was killed was actually the brother of the master of the dhow, so it was quite tragic. He was an Indian sailor.
I can understand that if anyone's going to be angry with the Iraqis, it's going to be the Kuwaitis. So you could appreciate if anyone was going to take action against them, it would most likely be them.
Yeah, so I think in that case it was just, one of these unfortunate things. It was that night. They were not as well practiced in boarding operations as necessarily us. These things happen, but I guess that incident highlighted the responsibility of the young boarding officers. He was just sub-lieutenant, in a very difficult situation.
And Peter, to your point, I think the Australian military is well known for its excellent training. But as you say, even though you're an overriding command, but not as strong a command over Polish and American forces as you are our own. And I suppose you're pleased that none of the incidents were ever our guys, and even the other incidents were well managed.
So my observation was that countries send very good ships and very good people, that they all have had workup and training before they come into theatre. So generally the standard's very high. And what they do bring is they bring a diverse range of skills. And so, the thing I used to say to people was that a multinational task group is much more capable than one from a particular nation, because you've got subtle differences in capability, and the important part for a task group commander is to understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of all those elements, get them to work together as a team, build a team culture. And so there was very much a strong team culture in the Multinational Interception Force as an identity, if you like. But having said that, you just need to be conscious that, sometimes you do have issues, and you just need to sensitively go through the national command structure if you need to have any changes made.
Peter, did you have much to do with the American Special Forces, the SEALs?
Well, we had a lot to do with them, just in terms of they would come out at least once a week doing boardings. That was in the lead up to the conflict. So we knew the SEAL team that had done that was the one that was going on to the offshore oil terminals at the outset of the war. So the SEALs did one of the offshore terminals and the Polish Grom did the other one.
So right now at the War Memorial, they have an exhibit on Special Forces. And I would imagine that as a commander with troops in the field, as you are overseeing, not only ours, but a whole multitude of nationalities, it must have been wonderful for you to actually be working with the best of these nations.
Oh, it was. And you felt very privileged in terms of, the thing I found was, from that first day, that there you are on an Arleigh destroyer, and sometimes you're operating off a cruiser, and you have this task group around you, and you just think, what a privilege. But also, it was really good of the Americans to give you that facility to be able to do that. It was a bit like being given a sports car to drive for the afternoon. It's a brilliant experience.
Peter, there was something funny you said before, that when the Iraqis were trying to smuggle out oil, you also said dates.
Yes, so reputedly Iraqi dates are the best. So they would come out in large numbers, and some will be processed, and some in little gift tins with stuff with almonds and so on, and others were just in bulk. But practically, it was a source of cash, and that was the thing that we kept on just sort of saying, that whether it's oil or dates, it's at the end of the day, it's just provide cash.
It's that hard currency.
Yeah, for the Saddam Hussein's regime.
So you have commanded this Maritime Interception Force during the Core Abdullah Waterway operations. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about those operations?
So I think part of it is the transition, and this is something that is quite often happens with the navies, is so for months we were enforcing sanctions in peacetime, and then of course come February, March it was clear that there was going to be a conflict, and so we had to transition from having a role of maintaining UN Security Council sanctions to actually being part of a combat force in conducting the invasion of Iraq. So we went from that part of the puzzle to then having quite a different range of missions. Some of the ships had to support the Royal Marine assault on the Alfor Peninsula with a bombardment. We had to ensure that all those dhows and steel hulls didn't block the naval operations happening further south. Most particularly, they didn't drop any mines. We also had to stop the Iraqi Navy from coming south and interfering. And so in the conduct of those operations in the first couple of days of the war, our force was actually able to stop some Iraqi Navy mine layers dropping mines into the northern part of the Gulf.
I know in the first Gulf War we sent over our clearance divers. Did you have them or similar divers at your disposal?
Yes, we did. So we had clearance diving team 3. So I guess in my position I had 2 hats. One was the National Naval Task Group Commander, where I had the 3 ships. We haven't mentioned Canimbla yet, but Canimbla arrived and she became part of our task group. And also we had the divers. Putting on my other hat, which was the Coalition Maritime Interception Officer Screen Commander hat, the divers weren't part of that. They were with the rest of the divers under a different task group organisation. So just had to manage those 2 chains of command and two jobs. The divers were really well prepared. They landed into Kuwait. They would then drive across the desert at the outset of the war overnight, go to Qasr, which was taken by the US Marines, and their role was to help facilitate the opening of the port of Qasr, which was going to be used as the hub for humanitarian aid shipping into Iraq. So they had an extremely busy job working with the American diving teams. The Americans had dolphins as well to get rid of the mines around the port area. There was huge amounts of ordnance, and going up and seeing them at work, I mean, they were in their element, but they're extremely well trained, both in terms of mine clearance, but also getting rid of lots of ordnance. And little kids would bring them all sorts of guns, ammunition, rockets, you name it, which they had to...
Probably in exchange for sweets or something.
Exactly, yeah. So that was that bit. But I think it's probably worth, if I can, just go back to Canimbla. So Canimbla came into theatre, and so this was a month or so before the war started. So this was in the early part of 2002. She was coming with strategic stores, large stores for the Australian Army, Air Force and Navy elements that were going to participate in the conflict. She was originally going to then be used as a strategic lift ship up and down the Gulf supporting logistics. Canimbla had previously been in the Gulf doing boardings. And so she was well versed in boardings, but she was going to be an ideal command platform for the Maritime Interception Force in this new role that we're going to do. She had really good communications facilities. She was operating off a different satellite from the one the Americans were using, or constellation the Americans were using. So that was important for us in terms of having adequate satellite bandwidth. She had lots of planning space, lots of room. And one of the concerns we had from just a practical perspective, there was about 300 dhows and there was 150 merchant ships up the Khor Abdullah waterway. If all of those came south, they would have swamped our ability to generate boarding teams. And as I said, on a good day, we could have about 6 boarding teams in the water at any one time. So we calculated we needed to have about 20. So how could we do that? Well, we'd have a few extra ships, and the Brits gave us a couple of extra frigates, which was most useful. But what we worked out was we needed the Canimbla, and we also needed the Polish ship, the Janicki, to actually have extra boarding teams on board. So Canimbla, for example, had 130 extra personnel from Brits and the Americans, and they were boarding teams, extra boats, cooks, mechanics, all those logistic things you need. And I was able to get them from the ships operating further south. So there was a lot of American ships which are operating further south. Over the months, some of them had gone through the Maritime Interception Force, so they knew the job that has to be done. They were further south where they had to be to fire their Tomahawk cruise missiles, and so they're only too happy to give us boarding teams and ribs and cooks and so on. So Canimbla became this hub and in the nerve centre for the Maritime Interception Force. And so that then allowed us to then be able to generate about 20 boats at any one time, or boarding teams at any one time, if we needed to.
And what would have been the maximum number you had to deploy?
So the big deployment happened when, like all things, we had quite an elaborate plan of how we're going to clear the boats. And in fact, one of the things, just simple things, we had to give them a map with a route of the route they would follow down the western part of the Gulf to clear the area. We would paint a white circle on their decks so that aircraft could see, okay, that was a ship that's been cleared and can proceed. So there was a whole range of things that had to be thought about and put in place. But 2 days before the war started, there was this mass breakout of dhows, and they were chucking bags of dates in the water to indicate that they weren't smuggling. And there had been an erroneous report on BBC radio that the war was about to start. So our best laid plans had to be quickly adjusted, and I called the commander of 5th Fleet in Bahrain, explained the situation, recommended what we do is we actually clear all these vessels now early and get them out of the way, which he agreed. And so we then generated that large number of boarding teams to start clearing those vessels. And in the end, that was a great benefit to us because it cleared the battle space of merchant shipping.
So, Peter, when did you finish up as MEO?
First week of April, I think it was. For me, the hot part of the war was very quick. The maritime campaign in the Iraq War happened within a couple of weeks, essentially. And really, the key bit was those first couple of days when we stopped the mine-laying operation, did the bombardment on R4 and escorted the minesweepers and did riverine patrol up the Corabella waterway. So we then poured into Jebel Ali in the Canimbla, and then Captain Mark Kellum and his team took over. But we were pretty well exhausted. We'd actually extended our time. We were due to be replaced, but because when the war was going to happen, it made sense to keep the team that had been there for so long and knew the plan and in fact was involved in the development of the plan. So we were overdue for replacement, as was Darwin and Anzac, and both those ships did a terrific job in sustaining themselves for that extra period.
So, Peter, for your service, and again the ship's company, you're recognised by the Navy and the American Navy.
Yes, so that was very kind of them. So I received a Distinguished Service Cross, and from the Americans, the Legion of Merit. And Canimbla, which I was on, that received a unit commendation.
In November 2011, you were promoted to Vice Admiral. Can you tell us briefly about your last few years in the Navy?
Yeah, so really after that time at sea as a captain, I then got promoted and went to Canberra as what was called a capability development job, a job which involved developing the specifications and requirements for capability. And I went into a communications job looking at communications and IT. And the reason being was the Chief of Navy said, well, you've been in the Gulf, you've seen how these complex communications work, and I want someone who's used those sort of systems familiar with them to be in that job. So the thing I found in the Navy is that you end up you have these career changes. Although you spend 40 years in the Navy, you have such diverse jobs. And so really from when I became a Commodore on, you ended up being in sort of more business management jobs, being involved in contracting and all sorts of things. So I ended up doing that requirements job, then as a 1-star, and then as a Rear Admiral, I was the deputy in that group, and then finally I was in charge of the Capability Development Group, which looked after the Defence Capital Equipment Program in terms of developing the program for approval by government and the Defence senior leadership, and developing the business cases that went to government for their approval.
Peter, there's so much we can keep talking about. From all your writing on maritime strategy and naval history to other key moments in your career. However, let's focus on the Australian Naval Institute. You're the president and you've launched a podcast. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Yes, so for the last 18 months, we've created a naval studies group at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, at the Defence Academy. And one of the things that we're doing is doing a podcast series. And as you indicated, I'm president of the Australian Naval Institute, and the Naval Institute is one of the partner organisations, in addition to the Submarine Institute, Naval Historical Society and the RNC Power Centre, pooling their expertise and some resources to do this podcast series. It really focuses on particular incidents in the Navy's history, and so we've done ones, for example, on the Battle of the Coral Sea, or one coming out shortly is on the Navy in confrontation, and getting historians and also getting some veterans just to analyse that particular chapter in our history for about 50 minutes. And so we've put it on YouTube and we put it on any podcast app, and so it's been quite a rewarding thing, and I think we've learnt a lot from Life on the Line and what you've done here. I think Life on the Line's a fantastic initiative, and I think what we're doing with the Australian Naval History is sort of complements that activity.
Peter, what I like about what we're both doing is you're doing the big picture, the strategic, the big stories, and then we're coming down to that personal level where we're talking about Army, Navy, Air Force personnel. And your story is typical of so many of the more modern, or indeed many of the career Navy guys. You're a modern Navy guy, and your story is just wonderful how you can basically grow up, finish your education down at Creswell, which arguably, and of course I'm biased, but it's the most beautiful setting to learn your basic training. And you have a life that takes you all around the world. You're dealing with all the very best people from all the best countries, making a really important, meaningful difference for world stability as we played in the particular Gulf incidents. And here you are back in Australia and now recounting the stories and the experiences of this nation and these people who have all served the country. I would like to support your podcast series in particular. I have a bias. I love the Coral Sea episode, which was the first one I listened to. And I think, like many of these things, Coral Sea is just another one of these stories that we as Australians know so little about. And your organisation is doing a wonderful job in highlighting the significance of Coral Sea, indeed Navy life and service. Peter, there's a lot that we could keep talking about, but is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we finish today?
Probably just one thing. One of the things I found from my time in the Gulf, I knew at the time that was the most significant thing I was ever going to do in the Navy. And so I tend to think, well, that happens to lots of people in life. Sometimes the most significant thing isn't necessarily at the end, but what you do have to do is just be appreciative you had that opportunity, but just continue to get as much as you can from the rest of your career, but don't always see that the rest of your career may be that elusive highlight, because sometimes it's not.
Peter, your story is a life experience of service, and your service really came to a head in the Gulf. You were well trained for it. You executed it brilliantly. We are very grateful for your service to this country, and thank you for coming and sharing your wonderful story with us today.
Thanks very much, Angus, for the opportunity to share the story about the Maritime Interception Force.
That was Angus Hordern speaking with former Vice Admiral Peter Jones, AO, DSC. Look up Peter's various works online, including Australia's Argonauts, his first book. Look up the Australian Naval Institute at navalinstitute.com.au, and look up the Australian Naval History Podcast. You can watch the podcast on YouTube or listen through Apple Podcasts. Get in touch with the Naval Studies Group about the podcast by emailing navalstudiesgroup@gmail.com. And you can email the team behind this podcast, Thistle Productions, by emailing podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com, and we're on social media too. Make sure you're subscribed in your podcast app to get all content. We have an array of fascinating veteran conversations yet to come this season, from World War II Navy and Air Force to modern-day Special Forces. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget,